He may be isolated on the international stage, but at home, Russia's president still speaks to roaring crowds.
When we are together, we have no equal. For the unity of the Russian people, hooray!
Tens of thousands gathered in Moscow's Luzhniki Stadium to honor their soldiers fighting in Ukraine.
Россия!
But behind the patriotic fanfare, Putin is a leader with little to cheer about 1 year into his invasion of Ukraine. Western intelligence estimates as many as 200,000 Russian troops have been killed or wounded in the year since the invasion, an average of nearly 550 soldiers each day. His army, once believed to be second only to the US's, is widely considered to be on the ropes. And the Kremlin's crackdown on critics has made it difficult to gauge popular support for the war. But Putin is banking on Beijing to help change his fortunes. And on Wednesday, China's top diplomat appeared to be extending a helping hand. Meeting in Moscow, Wang Yi pledged to strengthen ties with Russia.
We're willing to work with the Russian side to maintain strategic stability and deepen political trust, to strengthen strategic cooperation and expand all-round practical cooperation, so as to maintain a greater role in safeguarding the legitimate rights of our two countries.
The visit, a demonstration of defiance at a time when the two countries' relations with the West are at their lowest point since the Cold War.
The comprehensive strategic partnership between Russia and China has never been directed against any third party, and of course it will not be impacted by interference and provocation from any third party. We will not yield to any coercion by any third party.
The meeting is likely to further fuel fears in Washington that Beijing could soon start providing lethal weapons to help Moscow turn the tide on the battlefield. Adding to the tension, the Kremlin on Wednesday suspended a critical nuclear arms control treaty with the U.S., leaving Western leaders worried that the second year of the war could turn even uglier than the first.
Well, for more, I'm joined now by the U.S. diplomat William Courtney. He is an adjunct senior fellow at the RAND Corporation think tank, and he has served as U.S. ambassador to Kazakhstan as well as to Georgia. Ambassador, it's good to have you on the program. I want to start by getting your take on whether or not President Biden, did he deliver what he was supposed to today in terms of security guarantees to NATO's eastern flank members? Did he do what he needed to do?
Well, for 3 days now, he has delivered. The visit to Kiev was really courageous and extremely inspirational. Then in Poland, and now with the meeting of the East European leaders, he has provided reassurance that the United States is in this for the long haul. It's going to be supporting Ukraine along with our European allies. And the alliance really has been remarkably unified throughout this process.
We know that the visit underscores the changes that have taken place here since the end of the Cold War and Russia's return to a hot conflict in Ukraine a year ago. How radically, would you say, has that changed NATO?
Well, it's revived NATO in a pretty serious way. You'll recall a couple of years ago, President Macron said that NATO was brain dead. That's not the case any longer. And then we're seeing the Eastern members of the alliance play an extraordinarily important role, especially Poland, but all the Eastern members. So I think this has reinforced in NATO the importance of earlier NATO enlargement and how that has strengthened the alliance for the challenges today.
Yeah, we've seen the West at pains to emphasize unity in the face of Russian aggression. We've seen this week from Moscow, President Putin maybe sending mixed messages, suspending participation in the New START treaty with the U.S., and then saying later that it's not exiting the treaty. I mean, how should we read Russia's current line?
Well, two aspects of that speech. First, it was really remarkably defensive. He had no bold new initiatives, no outline of what are the real goals that the Russian government is pursuing in Ukraine. And then with regard to strategic arms limitation treaty, the New START treaty, 2 years ago when President Biden came into the office, the Russians were practically begging the U.S. to extend the treaty for another 5 years, which President Biden was inclined to do, and he did do. President Trump was not inclined to do that. And so I think at this point, while the Russians have suspended their participation, they've rushed to make sure that they are telling us that they're not going to exceed the numerical limits in the treaty. I think they are afraid that if there were open competition, that U.S. Nuclear production lines for our nuclear forces are hotter than Russia's, and that we can leap ahead, especially with our stronger economy.
We've seen this invasion take place now almost exactly 1 year. We've seen Russia lose troops, lose the initiative, lose momentum. Can you imagine the Russian military recovering?
So the Russian military is basically doing what it did in the Second World War, and that is trying to rely on mass to overcome other deficiencies. So the partial mobilization, so-called, of 300,000 is meant to help replace the really large number of Russian forces which have been casualties in this war, probably up to 200,000 or so. So this can help. But if Russian units continue to lose large casualties, and often military experts say if a unit loses 30% of its personnel, it's no longer functional. This is a real risk for Russia that this is going to continue because the Ukrainians have been fighting better than the Russians.
And at some point, this war has to end. I mean, how do you see this conflict ending? Do you see an exit ramp anywhere for Vladimir Putin?
The only real exit ramp is for him to pull his troops out of Ukraine. That may happen at some point. Hasn't happened yet. The Tsar's forces collapsed in World War I and they came back. So there are various possibilities. The strains in the Kremlin now are greater than before. We're seeing open warfare between a Putin ally, Prigozhin, and Putin's military, for example. That's really unusual. So it's difficult to predict what will happen. I would think that if one had to look a year ahead, one might safely predict that the Ukrainian position is going to be better than it is now, even better than now. But whether the war will be over or not, whether it will be victory or not, is just too difficult to predict.
Yeah, I mean, it does look like maybe the momentum is going to be in favor of the Ukrainian military. That brings me to my final question for you. Ukrainian President Zelensky, he keeps, hitting the point that victory will mean retaking territory that the Russians have illegally annexed, including Crimea. Do you think that that is a plausible, realistic victory?
But taking the rest of Ukraine, except Crimea, that is quite plausible. Crimea is more difficult. Taking it militarily would require an amphibious combat capability that Ukraine does not have. And Russia forces in Crimea could block the narrow isthmus. It's only 7 or 8 kilometers wide. So that would be quite a challenge for Ukrainian forces. But let's not forget that in Moscow, if they lost the rest of Russia, there could be a change of some sort in policy, and they might be willing to pull out of Crimea as well. But we just can't make a prediction.
William Courtney, Senior Fellow at the RAND Corporation and former U.S. Ambassador. Ambassador, we appreciate your time and your valuable insights tonight. Thank you.
You're quite welcome.